The Cashmere Botanical Gardens are a pretty interesting place. The gardens, despite being in the mountainous regions of Georgia, have a nearly constant temperature between 70 and 85 degrees. It has never snowed in the Cashmere Botanical Gardens, and it's utterly immune to the cold snaps and freezing warnings that sometimes affect the area. The plants here require only minimal care, seeming to get exactly what they need to flourish from the soil and their regular waterings. The place should not exist, especially not in a town as provincial as Cashmere, but it does. It's no secret either that 8 to 10 people disappear in the gardens every year. That's not to say they're killed. That's not to say they're abducted. What the park reports is that 8 to 10 people are reported missing to the park staff every year, and those people are passed on to the police and later to the FBI. None of them are ever found, none of their remains ever surface to be identified, and none of them are ever heard from again. They simply come into the park, sometimes with their families or friends or just by themselves, and they are never heard from again. The decorative ponds on the grounds have been dredged, the surrounding woods have been checked and rechecked, dogs have been brought in to smell them out, but no evidence of foul play is ever reported. Only 2 constants can be reported in these disappearances. The victims are always male, and the disappearances have always been between March 1st and September 15th. I only know these things because they're part of the new employee orientation. They tell the botanists, the visiting scientists, the groundskeepers to be careful. They've had staff reported missing as well, though I somehow doubt that they get reported to the police along with the others. We have to sign long release forms before we're hired that absolve the gardens of any wrongdoing should we disappear on the job. The owners are aware that strange things happen here, and they consider it a small price to pay for a botanical garden that seems to reside in an everlasting summer, even in the depths of winter. I, however, am no researcher, no botanist, not even a groundskeeper. I'm a member of their security staff. I started on day shift, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., and the old guy they had me working with turned out to be a glorified desk clerk. Randy was 45 and clearly liked the cushy job he had. He was the embodiment of a rent-a-cop, soft-bodied, eternally sitting, and he let me know how it was going to be right off the bat. I man the security booth, answer the questions and file the reports. You maintain a secure presence around the park. Look sharp, kid. As you may or may not have heard, people have gone missing around here. Translation: you do all the walking, and I do all the easy stuff. So, for the next month, I walked my boot soles off as I toured the park. There was an electronic cart that the security was supposed to ride around in, but the battery was bad, and they'd never gotten around to changing it. So, I was left to make rounds with my flashlight, my ring of keys, and a radio that would get me little more than worthless acknowledgement. Every hour we were supposed to make a check of the grounds, but during the day I seemed to be constantly going from one problem to another. The garden played host to many people who came to see the beautiful displays and rare plants, but most of the others came simply to pass the time or get up to nonsense. Every day seemed to be another chance to break up nicking teens, stop people from touching the flowers, throw out people who came in to cause trouble, or to ask groups of tourists who were here to look into the mystery to stop trampling on the displays. That first month was hell, even for $25 an hour. In that time, though, I did see the pale lady. I was yelling at some tourists, one of whom was ankle-deep in the reflecting pool of lilies, when I looked up to see her. At first glance, I thought she was another tourist. I had just looked up to tell her to get back on the walking path, when I noticed her alabaster skin and unmoving posture. I felt a strange tremor run through my body as I looked at her, and I hardly noticed my wet socks and dripping boots as I led the tourists towards the front gate. After that, I found reasons to have my rounds take me to that particular pool. The Pale Lady was a statue that was gifted to the garden by Dr. Thurston, the head of the gardens, about 10 years ago. It sits out in the north reflecting pool, surrounded by water lilies, and is truly a work of art. The statue depicts a woman in a long, flowing robe, her hair unbound and hanging down around her back. She covers her face with a fan, her eyes staring out cat-like and playfully. The temperature around that pool is always summery, the water never so much as growing sluggish in the winter. The statue seems to be the epicenter of the good weather that surrounds the garden, and management has made it the centerpiece of the garden. I asked Randall about the statue, and he just shrugged and turned the page on his magazine. Thing's creepy. I remember having to work nights when I first started, and that pond was my least favorite spot to walk. I always felt like it was watching me. I'm pretty sure that it wasn't there a few times. Carl can say what he likes, but something off about that statue. I asked him for more, but he looked up from his hot rod mag to ask me if I didn't have something better to do. When I showed up the following day to find a brand new officer learning the ropes from Randy, it appeared that I did. Carl says you're on night shift now. Didn't he call you? No. What happened to the night guy? Who knows? He just abandoned his post. Mark was always kind of flaky. I nodded, but couldn't help feeling a little skeptical. Mark had been flaky, but he still had alimony to pay. No one walked away from a $25 an hour job where most of your shift was spent sitting on ass. He was working the night shift, sitting in the booth from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., and his relief had come in the next morning to find him gone. The camera showed him leaving the booth at around 4 o'clock, getting on his appointed rounds. He walked off towards the north reflecting pool at 4:10, and after that, who could say? No trace had ever been found of him, and I guess they decided I'd be a good fit for it. One phone call later to confirm, and I took myself back home to get ready for that night. I had never worked the night shift at the garden, as I mentioned, so I wasn't really sure what to expect. I knew it was a position I'd be filling by myself, and I was a little excited about that. From what Carl had told me on the phone, it was mostly a lot of watching cameras and making sure I hit my hourly rounds. He said the boss liked to make sure everything was locked up after the gates closed at sunset, and that he sometimes watched the cameras to make sure the guards weren't shirking their rounds. So you make sure you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, and for God's sakes, don't fall asleep. So, with that, I frittered away the rest of my day, till it was time to go to work that evening. March 25th. There was a big binder on my desk when I got there, and Randy made sure I got the keys before he left. Better you than me, kid. You couldn't pay me enough to stay in this creepy old place at night. He left in a hurry, and I was left with another hour of daylight before they made the announcement to close the gates. The first couple of hours weren't too bad. I walked the grounds, helping people like I usually did. I directed some folks towards certain exhibits and made sure the buildings were secured after the botany staff left for the day. When the gates closed, I did another walk around and looked for stragglers and people who might be hiding. We do occasionally get troublemakers after hours who think it's funny to try to stay in the park and steal things overnight. There was none of that tonight, though, and as I finished my rounds, I went back to my desk and watched the cameras. I set an alarm on my watch so I wouldn't miss my next round in an hour, and I contented myself with watching the grainy CCTV footage from the security monitors. They had cameras just about all over the park. You could see most every entrance and exit from the exhibits, and some of them had cameras over the exhibits as well, like the rare flowers or the endangered species room. One of these cameras faced the pond for the Pale Lady, and I found myself coming back to that one again and again. The longer I looked at it, the more it seemed to move sometimes when I took my eyes off of it. Yeah, I know what that sounds like, but it's true. Sometimes you stare at something for so long that it seems to move. The statue was no different. It would wiggle its arms, move its fan, even seem to sway a bit, but it was all things I could chuck up to the grainy camera footage. I'd go back and check on it during my rounds too, but it always sat in the same place it had always been. I've tried not looking at it so much, since I could feel myself lingering the more I did. There was just something about it that pulled me towards it, and I worried that one night I might walk into the reflecting pool and sink in the mud. I can't really say the weirdness started on the first night, but by the third night, I knew something was weird around the Botanical Garden. March 26th. It was just a little thing. Nothing really weird, nothing worth reporting, but definitely worth writing about. Between 1 a.m. and 1:15 a.m., the Pale Lady statue disappeared. I was listening to the radio and watching the monitors. I had just tipped a cup of coffee to my lips when I scrolled past that particular monitor. I had got it from the vending machine by the office, and it tasted like mud water. Still, it was better than nothing if I was going to stay up all these late nights. I was cycling through the cameras, here a rare plant, there a pool of lilies, and when I came to the statue, I had to scroll it back to make sure of what I was seeing. I scrolled forward and back a couple of times to make sure it wasn't a bug or some kind of electrical failure. But after 5 minutes, I couldn't find any reason for the error. The statue was just gone. I wasn't too worried at first. I mean, it was a statue. Where was it going to go? I kind of thought it might be some sort of electrical problem after all, but couldn't figure out why it would disappear just the statue. So I grabbed my mag light and brought my coffee with me and went to go check it out. I was due for a round in about 10 minutes anyway, so I supposed I'd just started a little bit early. The Pale Lady's lily pond is towards the middle part of the round, so I found my way around the rest of the exhibits as I came towards that particular spot. It was about 1:12 when I got to her pond, and I expected that I would show my flashlight into the willows out there and find her still on her pedestal. Seeing the area, I checked around the pond and her pedestal, but the camera hadn't lied. The statue was gone. I immediately started looking around for clues. The statue wasn't cheap, at least I figured it wasn't, and if it came up missing and I couldn't find it, I was likely going to get fired. I checked for footprints, since someone had clearly gone into the pond to get it, and for signs of entry over the wall, since they would have had to get in here somehow. I had just completed my search, finding nothing, when I heard a weird grating noise. If you've ever heard kids playing with sidewalk chalk, it's about all I can equate it to. It sounded like someone pushing chalk over concrete, except the volume on it was about 100 times what I was used to. I turned around, trying to see what had made the noise, and I kind of figured it might be somebody trying to quietly move the statue. I expected to see a couple of guys nearby, the statue between them as they pulled and pushed on it, and I pulled out my phone so I could call the cops if that was what it was. Instead, I found the statue of the Pale Lady back on its pedestal, as if it had never gone anywhere. I held it in the beam of my flashlight for about 2 minutes, trying to see what the hell was going on. There was no way I had missed it. I'd checked the whole damn area for that statue, but here it was. I made another pass around the pond, looking for clues or anything that might tell me what had happened. After 30 minutes, I realized I wasn't going to find anything, and made my way back to the booth. I pulled out a report to write it up, but by the time my alarm went off for my next round, I realized I hadn't written anything. What was there to write? Was I going to tell Carl that I thought the statue had gone only to find out that it had been there the whole time? I'd sound like a lunatic. Best case scenario, they would laugh at me and call it nighttime jitters. So, I decided not to report it. The rest of my night went by pretty quietly. March 27th. When I came in for my next shift after a day off, Randy seemed genuinely happy to see me for the first time ever. Wasn't sure you were going to be here or not. Some of the new guys leave after their first night and never come back. Kinda glad you didn't run off. You seem more stable than the rest of them, he added. After that business a couple of nights ago, I kept a careful watch over the statue. I kept a little record, too, which is what you're probably reading here. Just something for my own peace of mind so I could prove I wasn't losing it. That night, I saw the statue disappear from its spot in the lily pond twice. I witnessed it return every time on camera, and it was always gone for 10 to 20 minutes at a time. I thought about going to check on it, but decided against it. I hadn't liked being out there when it was gone. Felt like something was creeping around out there, and the thought of that statue moving around on its own wouldn't leave my mind. March 28th. It happened 2 more times tonight. While on my rounds, I discovered it gone both times, though I never stuck around to see it come back. If I were watching on camera, there would be a puff of static followed by a sudden reappearance of the statue, and after the first time, I never questioned it. It was a strange little mystery, but that was about it. March 30th. It all came to a head tonight. Tonight, I met someone on my rounds, and I have to believe that it was the Pale Lady. She had lured me into a false sense of security by staying put Saturday night. I usually noticed her gone between 1 and 5 a.m., so when Saturday came and went with her still in her lily pond, I began to doubt the experience of the week. It was my first week of night shifts. Maybe I was just seeing things, jumping at shadows. I went home and slept, waking up fresher than I had in days, and spent most of the night without so much as a hiccup. The park closes early on Sunday, so by the time I got there, it was already locked up, and all I had to do was my usual rounds and watch my usual cameras. Randy stuck around for almost an hour to talk about how the new kid had needed to leave for an appointment or something. He was a little miffed because he had had to do rounds for the last 3 hours by himself, and he didn't feel that someone with his kind of time in should have to do things like that. I listened and pretended to be sympathetic, while I felt it was his comeuppance for being a lazy ass. What kind of appointment would you have on a Sunday anyway? I tell you, kids today are so lazy and unreliable. It was just starting to get dark when he left for the day, and after that it was just me and the quiet, empty gardens. The next 6 hours seemed to drag by. I sat in the security booth and listened to the radio mostly. I did some camera watching, went and ran some birds out of one of the exhibits, and really just had fun sitting on my butt. Around midnight I checked the cameras and found everything where it was supposed to be, the Pale Lady included. I grabbed my flashlight and my keys and went out to do my midnight round, expecting nothing more strenuous than some leftover trash to pick up along the way. I was just coming around the edge of an exhibit when I saw something further up the path. I guess saw wasn't the right word. I heard her before I saw her. It sounded like someone was dragging a rock along the concrete, and it reminded me of the sound I heard the other night when the statue went missing. As I came closer to the pond, I saw a woman walking slowly up the path. It looked like a woman, at least. Watching her walk, I thought she might be an older lady who was walking a little stiffly. Her gait was slow and looked like it hurt her to put one foot in front of the other. I called out and asked her how she'd gotten in here. To tell the truth, it scared the hell out of me. I hadn't seen a living person since Randy left for the day, and the sudden appearance of someone new put the hairs up on the back of my neck. She just kept walking, like she hadn't heard me, and I quickened my pace as I got in front of her so I could confront her. It wasn't that hard. She wasn't exactly running, but as I came around her, I realized she was holding a fan, blocking her face from sight. She was dressed in old clothes, like a Ren Fair dress, and her hair was hanging loose around her shoulders. Sometimes the gardens hire people in costume to walk around, but I hadn't got a memo about any upcoming events. They certainly wouldn't be here in the middle of the night either, and I felt pretty confident that she wasn't supposed to be here. I stood in her path, and as she tried to go around me, it seemed that she noticed me as I shouted at her a second time. "Excuse me, ma'am, the park is closed for the night. What are you doing here?" For a moment, all we did was stare at each other. I seemed to have startled her as badly as she had startled me, but she recovered a little quicker than I had. She took a step towards me, extending her hand as if she meant to touch my face, and I took a step back out of her reach. I was a head taller than she was, but I still didn't want some strange lady touching my face in the middle of an empty garden in the middle of the night. I thought about raising my flashlight, but suddenly my arm was heavy. It was as if a great weight had been set on my wrist, and when she reached out to stroke my cheek this time, there was nothing I could do about it. "Such a handsome guardsman," she commented, and her voice was odd. She sounded both thousands of years old and painfully young. She sounded as if she had lived 1,000 years and only a single day. I can't really explain it to you, but she was so strange that I could do little but look into her eyes as they swam above the rim of the fan. "Would you like to walk with me?" she asked, but I got the feeling it wasn't a question. I got the feeling people didn't deny this particular lady and just walk away. I opened my mouth to tell her that would be lovely, but some primitive survival instinct slammed the brakes on my mouth. A strange voice argued that if I were to walk with her, I would never go walking with anyone again. This lady would lead me places, both terrible and beautiful, but they would not be places I would ever come back from. When I shook my head, it seemed to surprise her. "Sorry, ma'am. I'm on duty. Perhaps another time." She looked sad, but nodded from behind her colorful fan. She walked around me, continuing her stroll as I stood there like a statue. I didn't want to follow her. I suddenly wanted nothing so much as to not be here when Randy showed up in the morning. I wondered if this is what the other guards had seen. I wondered how many of them had gone with her, and how many of them had simply left as she continued to walk. I turned around to follow her, or to continue my rounds, or to just run as far as my legs could take me. And that's when something happened that I can't explain. I have a vague memory of her standing right behind me, her fan closed and her face on display. But I could no more tell you what she looked like than I could tell you the population of Madrid. If something happened, I don't have any memory of it. Everything suddenly and irreparably went dark, and the next thing I knew, there were people standing over me. Carl was there, and Randy, and a few other park staff that appeared to have come in early for Monday. Someone was shining a light in my eyes, and it made me squint as I came back to myself. The park had an EMT on standby, but it appeared that it was too early for him. The guy looked like an outside paramedic, and as I came around, he turned the light off and nodded. "How are you feeling, sir?" "Very confused," I told him as I sat up. "The last thing I remember is that it was nighttime, and I was on a round." I didn't remember the lady I had seen walking around until later that day. At that point, everything was still a little bit blurry. "He doesn't seem concussed," the EMT said, turning to someone I hadn't seen since my interview. I gulped. That was Dr. Thurston, the head of Cashmere Botanical Gardens. Dr. Thurston was intimidating in that way that all men of a comfortable age are. He wasn't particularly large, no bigger than I was, and he didn't look angry as he stood smiling placidly at me. But I knew that if he suspected I was on drugs, or I had decided to take a little nap on the sidewalk, that I'd be fired without question. Dr. Thurston smiled at me, his face that of Pa Cartwright in my mind, and he knelt a little as he got on eye level with me. "If I drug test you, son, are you going to be on the dope?" I shook my head emphatically. "No, sir. I never touched the stuff." "I believe you. Have you ever fainted like that before?" "No, sir." "When do you work next?" Tonight, sir." "Take tonight off, and Tuesday too. I'll tell Chuck that he's got an extra day this week. Get yourself checked out and get some rest. Come back fresh on Wednesday." He patted my arm, and I thanked him for his generosity. I wrote all this down as it started to come back, but I'm not sure how much is real and how much of this stuff my mind has created. I'll continue to keep this journal, just in case other weirdness happens. I can't afford to quit my job at the gardens, but there's definitely something strange going on. The pale lady seems to be at the heart of it. I know I saw her walking around, but when I asked Randy what they found on the footage, he said it was all static until after midnight. The next thing on camera was me, collapsed on the ground at about 1:15. Something odd is definitely going on here, and I mean to get to the bottom of it. You're still here. I thought you might be. Thanks for joining me for tonight's story. If your insatiable appetite for horror knows no bounds, might I suggest one of our playlists, or one of our previous stories in the archive? There should be one appearing at the end of the story any minute now. And of course, if you're not subscribed, why not go ahead and hit that subscribe button? Maybe hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the spooky things that we do here. If you prefer your horror a little more analog, you can always pick up one of my books. There's a link below to my latest, and it'll take you to all the great things that I've posted on Amazon. For my book lovers in the audience, I always suggest coming on down to Patreon so you can become part of my ghostly reader tier and get a book anytime I write one, which is usually about twice a year. Speaking of my patrons, let's go ahead and thank them. Thanks to Janet for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor, and thanks to Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Emily Coltsfoot, Stephanie Carrington, Marianne Schuler, Tyler Parker, and Jennifer Damron for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you're thinking you might like to become one of my patrons, follow the link below to my Patreon. And as always, however you support the show, I appreciate it. Till next time, Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.